Sometimes a single decision can completely change the course of our life. Have you ever wondered what would happen if, at that crucial moment, you had made a different choice? Andrew, a millionaire focused solely on his career, made this decision 10 years ago. He abandoned his wife, leaving behind a family in search of success and power. For him, the world seemed to be at his feet. But life has a curious way of taking its toll on mistakes. Now, a decade later, he comes face to face with the woman he once loved. Only this time, she's not alone. Beside her, a young boy who looks incredibly like Andrew. What does this mean? Has the past finally returned to take its toll? Prepare yourself for a story of regret, second chances, and the cost of poorly calculated decisions. If you want to continue learning and reflecting on stories that touch the soul and bring life lessons, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any content. Join us on this journey of self-knowledge and growth. Andrew walked through the airport without much expectation other than another business trip. However, amid the rushing crowd, something made him stop. His eyes settled on a woman in the distance, a familiar figure that made him shiver. That was Sarah, his ex-wife, the woman he left 10 years ago. Beside her, holding her hand, was a boy. And this boy, it was impossible to ignore the resemblance. The messy blonde hair, the bright green eyes. It was as if Andrew was looking at a younger version of himself. Reality hit him like a punch. This could be his son, the son he didn't even know existed. It was a moment of absolute shock, where everything around dissolved, leaving only the uncertainty of that reunion. And it's interesting how life often surprises us when we least expect it, isn't it? Andrew, who had distanced himself from everything and everyone, living a life focused on work and success, could never have imagined that a simple walk through the airport would bring him face to face with the past he would rather forget. But life has these ironies. And like Andrew, we've all experienced unexpected moments that force us to face our mistakes. The question is, what do we do when this happens? Andrew could just turn away again and continue with his comfortable life. Or he could face the ghosts that haunted him. What choice would you make? As he watched Sarah and the boy, Andrew felt the weight of all the decisions that led him there. It is interesting to note how, often, the decisions we make in search of a better life end up distancing us from what really matters. In Andrew's case, the incessant search for success took him away from true love, family, and human connections. And now, standing at that airport, he began to question himself. Was it worth it? And how many times do we also question ourselves about the choices we made in the past? The feeling of loss began to invade Andrew in an intense way. What once seemed like unquestionable success, his wealth, his glittering career, now seemed empty. Everything he had achieved couldn't fill the void left by Sarah and the son he never knew. It's like when we dedicate ourselves entirely to a goal and, upon reaching it, realize that it doesn't bring the expected happiness. Andrew was beginning to understand this, and the weight of this revelation was almost unbearable. He watched the scene without knowing what to do. Get closer, talk to them, apologize for all the past he destroyed. There were so many unanswered questions. The emotional paralysis that gripped Andrew is something many of us have felt when we realize that a single action, or lack thereof, can change the course of our life. We become stuck, unable to make any decision. And that's exactly what happened to Andrew at that moment. But it's interesting how, even in the face of uncertainty, destiny seems to guide us towards what we really need to face. Andrew didn't know it, but this unexpected reunion would be the turning point he so needed. And the most important thing here is to remember that sometimes life puts us exactly where we need to be, even if we didn't ask for it. Isn't it curious to think about how often we ignore the signs that lead us back to what really matters? From the outside looking in, anyone would think that Andrew was destined to find Sarah and that boy. After all, how could it be a coincidence? Deep down, he knew this was more than just a casual encounter. It was as if life was giving him a second chance to correct the mistakes he had made. And how many times have we come across similar situations, where life gives us an opportunity for redemption? The difference is in recognizing this chance and having the courage to act. And that's exactly where Andrew's story teaches us a valuable lesson: the importance of not ignoring life's defining moments. If he had moved on from that airport, gone back to his routine, he might never have had the chance to see his family again. And how many times have we also walked away from precious opportunities out of fear or pride? This is an important reflection for anyone looking for significant changes in their life. The moment at the airport marks the beginning of a journey of self-discovery and repair for Andrew. He would need to make difficult decisions, confront his past, and deal with the consequences of his actions. And there's no denying it. Moments like these can be extremely challenging, but they are also necessary for personal growth. It takes courage to look back, recognize mistakes, and above all, have the strength to change the future. Without knowing what would come next, Andrew already felt deep in his heart that his life was about to change. But he still didn't know exactly how. And this uncertainty, this emptiness in the stomach, is what we often feel when we are about to embark on something that will completely transform our trajectory. The most important thing is to move forward, even without having all the answers. After the unexpected encounter at the airport, Andrew was overcome with a sense of guilt that seemed to grow by the second. The weight of his past decisions began to suffocate him, and he could no longer ignore reality. Upon seeing Sarah and the boy, the penny finally dropped. He had abandoned not only a loving wife, but also, most likely, a son. This type of realization is something that can come with a vengeance, overturning any pride that has been built up over the years. Andrew knew there was no escaping this guilt. And for many of us, guilt can also be a sign that it's time to face our ghosts. The need to solve this mystery became an obsession for Andrew. He knew he couldn't continue his life without finding out who the boy was next to Sarah. Was it your son? Had Sarah moved on? Curiosity and anguish mixed in his mind, creating a whirlwind of thoughts. It's common to get lost in questions like these when we feel like something important is at stake. And in this case, it wasn't just a matter of curiosity, but of fixing something he had broken many years ago. This search for understanding led Andrew to make a decision. He would hire a private detective. And here's an interesting point. How many times in our lives do we turn to other people to help us find answers that we can't get on our own? Andrew knew that, in order to find Sarah and the boy, he would need the help of someone with more investigative skills. Sometimes, we need to recognize our limitations and know when to ask for help, whether professional or personal. With the detective working the case, Andrew began to reflect on what could have been. This is a mental exercise that many of us do throughout our lives, isn't it? We wonder what could have happened if we had made different choices, followed different paths. For Andrew, the main question was, what would his life have been like if he hadn't left Sarah? These reflections led him to realize that, although he had achieved financial success, he had failed at the most important things in life, relationships. This realization caused Andrew to completely review what he considered success. The money and material goods he had accumulated over the years no longer had the same shine. He began to realize that he had traded valuable things like love and family for an illusion of happiness based on status and power. And how many times do we do the same in our lives, believing that success is something that can only be measured on the material side? Andrew now knew that his definition of success needed to be completely overhauled. And then a question arose that Andrew couldn't avoid. How do you fix something that had been broken for so long? This is a universal question that we all face at some point. After all, it's not enough to just recognize mistakes. You need to find a way to fix them. In Andrew's case, that meant not only locating Sarah and the boy, but also finding out if there was anything he could do to redeem himself. But as many of us have discovered, asking for forgiveness isn't always enough to heal deep wounds. The guilt Andrew felt was beginning to transform into something more, a genuine desire to right the wrongs of the past. He knew that no matter how difficult it was, he needed to do what he could to redeem himself. And that's a feeling that, at some point, we can all share. How many times have we felt the need to correct something we did in the past, even though we know that the path to repair is long and full of challenges? Andrew was willing to walk this path, regardless of what lay ahead. As the days passed, the anguish of not knowing if the boy was really his son consumed him. Andrew couldn't stop thinking about what he would do if the answer was yes. He found himself caught between the past and the present, between the man he had been and the man he wanted to be. This feeling of being in emotional limbo is something many of us have felt. Uncertainty about the future, mixed with the weight of past actions, can paralyze us, but it can also motivate us to seek profound transformation. And so it was that Andrew, previously so focused on his work and his ambitions, now found himself at the mercy of something much bigger. He could no longer control the situation, and it scared him. But at the same time, this lack of control made him realize how much he needed this journey of self-discovery. The truth is that we often need to lose control to find the right path. Andrew was learning this the hard way. Now, with the detective in action and the certainty that he was on the path to discovering the truth, Andrew knew there was no turning back. The past he tried so hard to avoid was about to knock on his door with all its force. The only question that remained was whether he would have the courage to face what was to come. As Andrew awaited news from the detective, the ghosts of the past began to resurface with greater force than he could have imagined. It was as if every detail of the life he left behind, every unspoken word, every moment he chose ambition over love, was coming back to haunt him. He remembered how, 10 years ago, he left home without looking back, leaving only a cold, impersonal letter. At the time, he believed he was making the right choice by following Vanessa and seeking a life of luxury and power. But now those decisions seemed bitter and meaningless. The image of Sarah, lying in bed, peacefully asleep, as he silently left the apartment, was a memory that haunted him. How many times have we repeated scenes like this in our lives? Times when we leave behind people who love us, believing we are doing the best for ourselves, only to realize later that we have lost something irreplaceable. Andrew now understood that, in his search for a better life, he had set aside what really mattered. And there was Vanessa, seductive, ambitious, full of promises of a bright future. When Andrew met her, he was vulnerable, frustrated by the simplicity of life with Sarah. Vanessa offered everything he thought he wanted: money, influence, power. And beside her, he believed he was on the right path. But deep down, Andrew knew he was never truly happy with Vanessa. She represented the materialization of a superficial desire, and now he paid the price for having followed that impulse. These flashbacks brought up mixed feelings. On the one hand, Andrew felt angry at himself for being so blind and selfish. But on the other hand, he also felt a certain compassion for that ambitious young man that he was. After all, how many times are we seduced by the promise of something greater, without realizing that we are exchanging what is essential for what is ephemeral? The quest for success and status can be a dangerous trap, and Andrew now saw this clearly. The memories of the past seemed to form a painful puzzle. Andrew remembered how, after each date with Vanessa, he would return home with a feeling of emptiness. Sarah, with her sweetness and simplicity, never understood his never-ending search for something more. "Aren't we that happy?" she used to ask. But Andrew, blinded by ambition, didn't see happiness in small things. It's curious how we often miss the most precious moments because we are focused on what is beyond our reach. With each memory that surfaced, Andrew began to see his mistakes from a new perspective. He realized that by following Vanessa and leaving Sarah, he had not only lost the woman who loved him, but also the chance to be a father. Life with Sarah would have been simpler, without the pomp and glamour he sought. However, that simplicity now seemed far more valuable than any luxury he had experienced at Vanessa's side. And this leads us to reflect. How many times do we sacrifice genuine happiness in exchange for a distorted version of success? As Andrew relived those days, he wondered if it was possible to go back. Of course, he couldn't change what had already happened, but he could try to fix what was left. This is a dilemma that many face when the past knocks on the door. How to repair the damage we have caused? While the answer isn't always clear, the first step, as Andrew was discovering, is to honestly acknowledge our mistakes. At this point in the journey, Andrew began to wonder what had happened to Sarah shortly after he left. He didn't know it, but the pain he left behind was immeasurable. Sarah discovered she was pregnant shortly after he left, and had to deal with this reality alone. Andrew had no idea the impact his departure had on her life, and that was something he would have to face when he met her again. For him, the past was just beginning to be unearthed. And then, like a clock ticking again, Andrew began to feel like time was running against him. Every day that passed without an answer from the detective was a reminder that he couldn't continue living the same way. He knew that soon he would have to face Sarah, and even worse, he might have to face the boy, his son. What would he say? How would you explain all these years of absence? The answer was still unclear, but Andrew knew he was approaching the decisive moment. Sarah, on the other hand, had moved on with her life. During those 10 years of Andrew's absence, she had experienced moments of extreme difficulty, but also periods of great resilience. After all, it's not easy to raise a child alone, especially when the person you trusted most left you without even looking back. But Sarah, with the strength that many underestimate in solo mothers, managed to build a new life for herself and her son, Ethan. And little by little, she found in Mark a new source of support and love, someone who was willing to fill the void left by Andrew. Mark, unlike Andrew, was not a man of great ambitions or a dazzling figure. He was simple, kind, and, above all, dedicated. This is what won over Sarah, who had already suffered enough at the hands of a man who prioritized material success over love. With Mark, she found a peace she had never experienced with Andrew, and that peace was crucial to the new life she was building with Ethan. At many times in life, what we need most is stability, and Mark provided just that. But no matter how hard Sarah tried, there was something that could never be completely erased: the figure of Andrew, Ethan's biological father. Although Mark played the role of father with great responsibility and affection, Sarah knew that Andrew's past could still affect her son's future. This became evident in small moments, like when Ethan asked about his real father, or when he noticed how different he was from Mark in some ways. The truth is that, no matter how much we try to move forward, certain chapters in life always remain pending, awaiting an outcome. Seeing Andrew again at the airport moved Sarah deeply. For years, she convinced herself that she no longer needed him in her life, that she and Ethan were fine without him. And in many ways, that was true. However, when the past comes up again so abruptly, it is difficult to keep emotions under control. She didn't know what Andrew wanted, nor how he would affect her new family. But one thing was certain: Sarah wouldn't allow him to come into their lives and destroy everything she had worked so hard to build. It's interesting to think about how we often seek security and peace in relationships that offer us stability, as Sarah found in Mark. But at the same time, the presence of figures from the past can make us question this peace. Sarah knew that Mark was the right man for her and her son at that moment, but Andrew's appearance brought back old feelings that she believed she had overcome. And how often does this happen to us too? People we have already left behind suddenly return and make us doubt our choices. Ethan, in turn, grew up without knowing his biological father. For him, Mark was the only father he needed, someone who was always by his side, supporting him in every moment of his life. But like every child, curiosity about his origins began to emerge. Sarah always knew that one day she would have to tell Ethan the truth, but that day seemed to be coming faster than she had planned. How do you explain to a child that his real father abandoned him before he was even born? This was one of the questions that haunted Sarah the most. Mark, on the other hand, has never shown jealousy or insecurity regarding Sarah's past with Andrew. He knew that the love he built with Sarah and Ethan was strong enough to overcome any shadow of the past. However, upon seeing the way Sarah reacted to her reunion with Andrew, a small doubt began to creep into her mind. He wondered if, on some level, Sarah still had feelings for her ex-husband, and that bothered him. Even the most secure man can be shaken by the ghost of a lost love. For Sarah, the big question now was how to protect her new family from any interference from Andrew. She knew that Ethan would sooner or later discover the truth about his biological father, but she feared the impact it would have on him. Would Ethan be disappointed to learn that the man he admired so much had abandoned him? And more importantly, how could Sarah guarantee that Andrew wouldn't do more harm than good if he decided to get back together with the boy? This dilemma tormented Sarah in silence. She wanted the best for her son, and knew that Andrew's presence could complicate things. On the other hand, as a mother, she knew she couldn't lie to Ethan about her origins forever. The decision of how and when to reveal the truth would be one of the most difficult of his life. And in this context, Mark would also need to be considered. He had already played the role of father for so long that perhaps he felt threatened by Andrew's possible presence in their lives. With these concerns in mind, Sarah knew that her meeting with Andrew would not just be a matter of settling accounts of the past, but also of defining the future of her new family. Mark, Ethan, and her were bonded in a way that Andrew, try as he might, couldn't easily break. But Sarah also knew the situation was more complicated than she wanted to admit. The inevitable moment has arrived. Andrew knew he couldn't keep running, and Sarah, in turn, also knew that his presence required a frank conversation. When they finally met, the tension was palpable. Andrew, head down, approached cautiously, not sure how to begin. Sarah, on the other hand, was firm, but there was a storm of emotions inside her. She had mentally prepared herself for that confrontation, but nothing could truly prepare her to face the man who abandoned her and now wanted back what was once his. Andrew, his voice shaking, began to apologize. It was difficult for him to admit the depth of his mistakes, but he knew this was the first step towards any possibility of reconciliation. He tried to explain the reasons that led him to leave, talking about his ambition, about how he believed he was looking for something greater. But the truth is, as much as his words might have made sense to him, they seemed empty to Sarah. How to explain the 10-year absence? How can one justify abandoning a child he didn't even know existed? Sarah, in her grief, didn't want to hear excuses. To her, Andrew's words sounded like a belated apology from a man who had finally realized what really matters in life. But it was too late. When Andrew mentioned Ethan, it was like Sarah's world stopped for a moment. His son's name, said by that man who had never been part of his life, was like a blade piercing his heart. She knew he wanted to see Ethan, but she was willing to prevent any attempt to get closer that could bring pain to the boy. At that moment, Andrew knew it wouldn't be easy. He already expected resistance, but the intensity of Sarah's pain was much greater than he had imagined. He tried to argue, to say that Ethan had the right to know his biological father, but Sarah was firm. "You don't have that right," she said, her eyes full of tears and anger. And in a way, she was right. Andrew had left his family behind without worrying about the consequences, and now he suddenly wanted to return to a position he had abandoned. How many times do we see people who, after years, try to recover ties that they themselves broke? Sarah, despite all her resistance, knew she couldn't keep Ethan away from the truth forever. As much as she wanted to protect her son, she understood that, at some point, he would need to know who his biological father was. The problem was that she feared the impact this revelation would have on Ethan. She had raised him alone, and now, with Mark by her side, they were a family. How would Ethan react to learning that his real father abandoned him? And how would this affect your relationship with Mark? Andrew, in turn, began to realize that reconnecting with his son would be much more complicated than he imagined. He thought that by admitting his mistakes and showing regret, Sarah would eventually allow him to get closer to Ethan. But now, seeing how much his absence had hurt them both, he began to doubt whether he had the right to enter their lives again. The feeling of guilt grew, and Andrew found himself in a dilemma. Should he insist on his presence or respect the limits that Sarah was imposing? Despite her anger, Sarah was also confused. She wanted to protect Ethan, but at the same time she knew she couldn't erase Andrew's figure from their lives forever. Maybe it would be better for Ethan to know the truth now, rather than finding out later and feeling betrayed by it. But how can you tell the truth without hurting your child? It was a painful decision, and Sarah knew that no matter what she decided, there would be profound emotional consequences. The most difficult moment came when Sarah finally confirmed what Andrew already suspected. Ethan was her biological son. The words came out of his mouth with difficulty, loaded with all the pain and frustration accumulated over the years. Andrew, as much as he expected this confirmation, felt a mixture of relief and guilt. Relief at knowing he had a son, but guilt at realizing he had lost all these years alongside his own blood. Eventually, Andrew begged to meet Ethan. He knew that, as much as he didn't deserve it, he needed to at least try to establish a connection with the boy. But Sarah, still determined to protect her son, refused. "You're not going to destroy his life," she said firmly. Andrew stood there, not knowing what to say. He realized that it would not be a matter of days or weeks to repair the damage he had caused. It would be a long journey, and he would have to fight for every small step. And so, the confrontation between the two ended without a clear resolution. Andrew now knew he would have to earn back Sarah's trust and prove that he was truly willing to do whatever it took to be a part of Ethan's life. But the path would be arduous, and the future was still uncertain. While Andrew faced his past with Sarah, another force began to move behind the scenes, Vanessa. Upon discovering that Andrew had found Sarah and was trying to reconnect with his son, Vanessa was overcome with silent fury. It wasn't just the fact that he was revisiting a part of her life she believed was buried, but the threat it posed to everything she had built alongside him. Vanessa was not the type of woman who accepted being left behind, much less exchanged for someone she considered inferior. From the beginning, Vanessa always knew how to manipulate situations in her favor. That's how she won Andrew over, offering him the glamour, power, and influence he so desired. She was the embodiment of the success he sought, and together they formed the perfect couple in the eyes of society. But now, realizing that Andrew was starting to distance himself from the life they had built, Vanessa felt the need to take drastic measures. She knew that the best way to hurt him was to harm what he valued most, his money and his reputation. Vanessa coldly began planning her revenge. She was not the type of person who would explode in anger, but rather one who thought carefully about every step. His first move was to gather all the information he could about Andrew, his business, his weaknesses. She knew that Andrew had been involved in some questionable dealings over the years, and now this information would be her weapon. After all, in the war of feelings, whoever controls the secret controls the power. And Vanessa had a lot of power in her hands. Vanessa's calculated coldness is something many underestimate. She never saw herself as an ordinary wife. For her, marriage to Andrew has always been a strategic alliance. And now that this alliance was being threatened, she had no intention of losing out. When people feel like they are losing control, they often react in ways that can seem extreme. And in Vanessa's case, she was willing to destroy Andrew if necessary, as long as she kept what she felt was rightfully hers. She began moving behind the scenes, consulting lawyers and reviewing financial documents. It didn't take long for her to discover loopholes that could be exploited. Vanessa didn't just want a standard divorce where both parties move forward with a fair division of assets. She wanted to take everything from Andrew, leave him with nothing. And to do that, she needed to act quickly, before he could realize what was happening. It's fascinating how often those we trust most can become our worst enemies when interests begin to diverge. But Vanessa didn't want to stop there. In addition to destroying Andrew financially, she wanted to ensure that he was publicly discredited. She began leaking compromising information about her business dealings to the press, and before long, newspapers began publishing scandalous headlines about fraud and corruption involving Andrew's name. Vanessa knew that once his reputation was tarnished, he would lose the support of his partners and investors. And for someone like Andrew, who has built his identity around business success, this would be devastating. While Andrew dealt with the emotional issues surrounding Sarah and Ethan, he had no idea that on the other side, Vanessa was preparing a devastating attack. When he finally realized what was happening, it was already too late. Accounts were being frozen, businesses were falling apart, and his public image was completely ruined. It was as if everything he had built with so much effort was crumbling before his eyes. The irony of it all is that while Andrew was trying to redeem himself emotionally, he was losing everything in the field he valued most, finance. Vanessa, in turn, watched the chaos she had caused with cold satisfaction. For her, this was the best way to teach Andrew that he couldn't just walk away from his life with her and expect to come out unscathed. And how often do we see this in real life? People who, when they feel betrayed, seek revenge in a calculated way, hitting the other where it hurts most. In Vanessa's case, this revenge was not just emotional, but also deeply strategic. However, there is something that Vanessa didn't count on: the impact this would have on Ethan. While she was focused on destroying Andrew, she failed to realize that her actions were directly affecting the boy's life, who now found himself at the center of a scandal. News about his father began to circulate at school, and Ethan became the target of comments and curious looks. Sarah, who had always tried to protect her son from these complications, now found herself trapped in a whirlwind that was beyond her control. Vanessa, without realizing it, had started a chain of events that would affect much more than just Andrew. Despite everything, Vanessa remained relentless. For her, the game was still far from over. There was much more to be done, and she would not rest until she ensured Andrew was completely destroyed. However, what she didn't realize was that, by focusing so much on revenge, she was, in a way, destroying herself as well. Her obsession with making sure Andrew paid for his choices was consuming her, and like many vendettas, she was becoming a prisoner of her own anger. The relationship between Andrew and Ethan, still in its early stages, was full of uncertainty and conflicting feelings. Ethan, who grew up without a biological father, found himself confused and resentful at the idea that a stranger suddenly wanted to be part of his life. For Andrew, the situation was equally challenging. He knew he had no right to demand anything, but the need to get to know his son and build a bond with him consumed him. It wouldn't be easy to make up for 10 years of absence, and Andrew knew he would need patience and, above all, humility to deal with this situation. The first attempt to approach was timid and uncomfortable. Andrew, unsure of how to approach Ethan, tried to find a way to connect with the boy. But Ethan, understandably, was closed off. He saw in Mark the father figure that had always been there, and the idea of accepting Andrew as a father seemed strange, to say the least. For Ethan, what defined a father was not blood, but constant care and presence. And in that, Mark had been exemplary. Andrew realized that, first and foremost, he would need to prove that he was worthy of being in his son's life. The first meetings were marked by long silences and avoided questions. Andrew wanted to know everything about Ethan, but he knew he couldn't pressure him. Ethan, in turn, felt a mixture of curiosity and anger. How could that man just show up now and expect everything to be okay? These are questions that many children in similar situations face. The reappearance of a biological father or mother, after so long, can bring feelings of rejection, insecurity, and even betrayal. As time passed, small moments began to soften the barrier between them. Andrew, in an attempt to connect, remembered how he loved playing football when he was young, and, knowing that Ethan liked sports, suggested they play together. Although the beginning was hesitant, little by little sport became a means of communication for both of them. It's interesting how simple activities can serve as bridges in complicated relationships. For Andrew and Ethan, football wasn't just a game, but a way to start building something that words couldn't express. Even so, Ethan was still reluctant to fully accept Andrew. He saw his biological father's efforts, but the pain of his past absence was still very present. Mark, who had always been a stable figure, felt the impact of this new dynamic. He was not just a spectator in this story. He was the man who raised Ethan, who was there for every important moment. Seeing Andrew trying to reconnect with the boy he considered his son also affected him emotionally. Even without wanting to, he found himself torn between supporting Ethan and feeling jealous of the new relationship that was being built. Sarah, watching from afar, understood Ethan's internal conflict and Andrew's anguish. She knew that the boy needed time to process everything and that Andrew, as sorry as he was, would also have to respect his son's limits. Sarah's fear was that this approach could destabilize Ethan's life, but at the same time, she knew that Ethan had the right to know his biological father and decide for himself what to do with that information. It was a fine line between protecting his son and allowing him to make his own judgments. Over time, Ethan began asking difficult questions. He wanted to know why Andrew left, why he never came back for him, why he abandoned him before he even met him. These questions were painful, but Andrew knew he needed to face them honestly. Admitting his mistakes was the hardest step for him, but also the most necessary. He explained to Ethan that at the time he thought he was making the right choice, but now he saw how wrong he was. These conversations, although tense, were essential for any type of reconciliation to happen. Andrew began to realize that, although the journey was long, small gestures made a difference. He couldn't just declare himself Ethan's father and expect the boy to accept him. I needed to show, day after day, that I was present, that I wanted to be part of his life. It's curious how, in such fragile relationships, consistency becomes the key. Ethan didn't trust words. He wanted to see actions. And Andrew, even if hesitantly, was willing to demonstrate that he was changed and that, this time, he wouldn't leave. Ultimately, the relationship between Andrew and Ethan was still in process. There were no guarantees that they would become a typical family, and Andrew knew he could never replace the lost years. But there was a sense of hope in the air. Ethan, despite his initial resistance, was beginning to see that Andrew was genuinely trying to redeem himself, and that, for a boy who spent years believing he had been abandoned, was starting to mean something. After all the turmoil and revelations, Andrew knew the road to redemption would be long and full of obstacles. He had made serious mistakes, abandoned his family, and prioritized material success over the most important relationships in his life. However, recognizing these mistakes was the first step towards transformation. Now more than ever, Andrew was determined to do whatever it took to rebuild the bonds he had destroyed, especially with his son Ethan. This path, however, would not be simple. Redemption is rarely a quick or easy process. It requires time, consistency, and, above all, humility. Andrew had to accept that, as much as he wanted to fix everything at once, he would need to respect Sarah and Ethan's pace. After all, they were the ones most affected by his choices, and he couldn't just demand that they accept him back into their lives. This was one of Andrew's biggest challenges, understanding that emotional healing couldn't be forced. Each day, Andrew tried to make small improvements to himself. He began to reflect deeply on the choices that led him to distance himself from his family and fall into the traps of unbridled ambition. These reflections helped him see more clearly how selfish his past behavior had been. He realized that his relentless pursuit of power and status was motivated by deep-seated insecurity, and that this insecurity led him to sacrifice what really mattered. Now his focus was on rebuilding his life based on more solid values, such as love and responsibility. Andrew also began to make practical changes. He moved away from the questionable business practices that propelled him to the top, recognizing that building an ethical career was more important than accumulating wealth quickly. He looked for opportunities to help small businesses and entrepreneurs, feeling this was a way to give something back to society. These actions, although small, reflected his new perspective on life. The search for redemption was not just emotional, but also practical, and Andrew knew that his actions would need to speak louder than his words. Ethan, in turn, began to notice these changes. Although there was still hurt and mistrust, the boy saw that his father was making a genuine effort to be present and be a positive influence in his life. This, however, did not erase the years of absence and the pain that Andrew had caused, but it served as a start. The truth is that Andrew's redemption didn't just depend on him, but also on how Ethan and Sarah would react and feel over time. And that uncertainty was something Andrew would need to accept. Another crucial aspect of Andrew's journey was his ability to deal with pride. For many years, he saw himself as invincible, untouchable in his successful career. Now, he needed to admit his faults, both to his family and to himself. It's not easy for anyone to admit they made mistakes, especially when those mistakes have caused so much damage. But Andrew was beginning to understand that only by accepting his vulnerabilities could he truly grow as a person. This involved a sincere apology and being willing to listen to the pain he had caused. With Sarah, the reconciliation process was equally delicate. She was still deeply hurt by the abandonment and had difficulty trusting that Andrew had really changed. After all, he had already shown that he could put his ambitions above anything else. However, as time passed, Sarah began to see that Andrew was no longer focused on regaining what he had lost, but on building something new, even if that meant starting from scratch. The relationship between them would not return to what it was before, but there could be a new form of respect and understanding between them. As difficult as the journey to redemption was, Andrew found comfort in the small victories. Every honest conversation with Ethan, every act of kindness towards Sarah, every ethical decision he made in his career was a small achievement. He knew it wouldn't be easy to gain complete forgiveness, but every step he took in the right direction brought him closer to his goal. And this is something we can all learn. Redemption is a process, and every action, no matter how small, counts. In the end, Andrew was aware that his future was still uncertain. He didn't know if he would ever completely regain Ethan and Sarah's trust, but he was determined to keep trying. For him, true redemption would not only come from forgiving others, but also from the forgiveness he needed to give himself. He would need to live with his mistakes and the consequences of them, but now he saw it as part of his growth journey. The path would be arduous, but Andrew was finally willing to face it. After all this, the question remains: what would you do if you were in Andrew's shoes? How many times do we let our ambitions take us away from what really matters? Life gives us countless chances to start over, but are we always willing to pay the price? Perhaps the greatest lesson from this story is that, no matter how much time passes, it is still possible to seek redemption, right mistakes, and rebuild lost bonds. And you? Are you ready to change your life? Face what was left behind and move forward. Reflect on your choices. Go after what really matters and, above all, don't wait for it to be too late to do so. If you want to continue learning and reflecting on stories that touch the soul and bring life lessons, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any content. Join us on this journey of self-knowledge and growth.